Father Ryan Humphries. Welcome to the CU CateCast, and this week, the Book of Judith. Now, the Book of Judith is the middle of 3 books in the Deuterocanonical series. That is the books that Martin Luther did not have the wherewithal to translate, and each of these 3 is an absolute delight. These are the narratives, these are the movies of the Old Testament. In fact, each of them have been made into movies. The Book of Tobit is very much like a romantic drama. It's the Notebook. You have the wonderful story of, this young man who goes off and he slays the demon and brings back his wife and saves his family, and it's all wonderful, and it turns out that Raphael the angel was there the whole time. The Book of Esther that we'll get to next week is the Gothic horror story. It's a bit like the Phantom of the Opera. You have the world is going to end, everything is tragic, and then at the last moment the Lord comes and saves the day. And this week, the Book of Judith, which is the action movie. It's the Michael Bay movie. You have the big army stuff at the beginning, then the tragic character rises up. She puts on a little bit of sass and a little bit of purdy, saves the day through violence, and then the armies get together, and it's an outright brawl until the end. And we end with a little song, and then we're done. I mean, Michael Bay couldn't write a better script if he tried. And so this Book of Judith that we're doing today, the story itself is set way back in the Assyrian Empire. So we're thinking, the 800s BC, somewhere maybe down to the 500s BC, somewhere in there, remembering that this was a story that would have been told around the campfire. This is a story that would have been told at the hunting camp. It's the kind of story that's meant to be told with embellishments. It's meant to be told not in the same way every time. This is the kind of story the kids would have asked for. Dad, tell the Book of Judith again. And so it is an historical book, but it's not the kind of history where we would say this lines up evenly. This is a fish story of a book on purpose. And so we know it was written, we know the events happened somewhere back between 800 and 500 or so, but the book itself wasn't written until much, much later, probably closer to 100 BC, only 100 years before Jesus shows up on the scene. And we're making that assessment based upon the particular vocabulary that's used, the kind of slang words and the way that things were spelled that were appropriate to that time. Now, we have not talked much about this use of vocabulary as a way of dating books so far. We're going to get really into it later when we get to the book of Isaiah, for example, where we can actually pull out and say there are 3 completely different authors of the book of Isaiah, and the book was written over the course of at least 80 years because this slang word was only used here at this time, and that slang word was only used there at that time. And so there's a good amount of kind of like sophisticated study that's gone into this, but the Book of Judith we know would have not been written down much before 100 BC. And so thematically, it's a book about God's providence. God works in mysterious ways. He works through unexpected people, and ultimately, it's people who trust in God. Even when the whole nation doesn't trust in God, it's individuals who trust in God, what we would call saints, that God can work through and accomplish remarkable things. Now, all the people that are like this are 1, people who trust, but 2, people who are prayerful, and 3, people who are pious. Pious meaning they know their religious duties and they keep them. They're very serious about what they owe to God in justice. And, of course, one of the things that makes Judith wonderful is that she is aware of herself. She's aware that she is a beautiful young woman. She's aware that she can be sensual. She's aware she has feminine wiles, to use the slightly outdated term. And she understands her role culturally in not wearing those things at the beginning because she is mourning as a widow. And then she understands what it means to take off the widow's mourning garb, to put on all the purdy and somewhat skanky sometimes, and to go down and to seduce a man. She understands what's going on culturally as well as internally in that. And that's important because understanding oneself is a big deal. And in fact, a remarkable number of Old Testament figures show up in this kind of weird grouping of people who understand I'm blind, or I'm deaf, or I'm an outcast, or I'm a leper, or I am beautiful, or I am smart, or I am wise. And the ones who put on false perspectives of that never go far. But oftentimes what we might consider pompous for someone to say, well, I'm beautiful. I can use my beauty. Have you noticed how beautiful I am? That would be considered ludicrous for us, and yet we have a number of figures, not just in the Old Testament, but also in the New Testament as well as in Christian history, who have just acknowledged, I'm brilliant. I need to do something with it. Or I'm incredibly good looking. What can I do with that for the Lord? And so that's something that we see Judith aware of in a very deliberate way. So the story itself begins with... I jumped ahead accidentally to Tobit there. The story begins in a very, very deliberate way when Nebuchadnezzar, who is the king of the Assyrian Empire, decides he's going to invade Israel. In fact, he decides he's going to invade the Median Empire in modern-day Iran, and he calls Israel up and he says, hey, I'm calling in a favor. I need you to go over to Iran with me, send me some army people, and we're going to conquer the Median Empire. But the Israelites, the Jews, basically say, we're not interested. We're not going to do that. We're not sending troops your way. And so because of this, because the Jews refuse, Nebuchadnezzar loses patience, and he sends in a general to basically knock them in line, to bust their heads around, and maybe even to destroy the temple. And the emperor, or this general's name rather, is Holofernes. I had a conversation last night with a priest about exactly how to say this name. In Greek, it would probably be something like Oloferne, but we're not. The name isn't Greek. The name is an Assyrian name translated into Hebrew, which was then translated into Greek, which is then translated into English. So we have no clue what this cat's name was. But Holofernes is basically the way it gets said nowadays. And so a standoff ensues. Holofernes shows up at the city, and he says, we're going to basically quarantine the city, we're going to siege the city, and we're going to put a blockade up, and we're going to starve them out. So there is a guy who kind of is floating around, just one of these weirdo people. His name is Achior the Ammonite, which sounds like a cartoon book or like a comic book character. He's going to come in with Robert Downey Jr., and he says, I'm Achior the Ammonite, and I'm here to let you know that, hey, Holofernes, just be aware the Jews are undefeatable on their own soil because the Lord their God is a big deal. You can't beat them unless they sin. If they sin, you can destroy them. Otherwise, you've got nothing. Well, Achior does not make himself a very popular guy in the court with Holofernes there, so he gets run out of the camp, and so Achior sneaks into the city, and he's now under siege along with the rest of them. So the Jews are in a tight spot. The blockade is tightened, and as the story goes on, Holofernes manages to get hold of the water supply. It's an action movie. It's building. We've got story about the characters. We've got story about soldiers. We've got story about how many shields, how many spears, all kinds of details. And as the action movie moves up to that point, we kind of cut to an entirely new story with Judith. Judith is a young woman. She is a beautiful woman, but she's dressed all in mourning clothes because her husband has died recently, and it's tragic, and it's sad, and we get this incredibly beautiful kind of explanation of where Judith comes from. And then we get this moment where she goes to meet with the elders of the city, and everybody is wimping out. Everybody says, let's just give in. We don't want to die here. Yes, we know God can protect us, but we're not going to worry about that. We're just going to surrender. And Judith has no time for any of this nonsense. And so she gives them the young woman in ancient Israel, who's not allowed to even speak, speaks up and just swats these old men around and says, you bunch of losers. And she gives them this pretty rough little speech. And she says, you know what, if you bunch of doofuses can't get it done, I'll get it done because I trust in God. And so we get this sad, beautiful, tragic scene where she goes to her boudoir and she takes off the clothes of mourning and she puts on all the beautiful clothing and then puts on her makeup. And you could see telling this around a campfire, how the little girls would be excited about this. And they would be imagining, what could the makeup look like? And what colors? I wouldn't put on purple. I'd use teal. Oh, I'd use that green. No. Use red around the eyes. And you could see how this kind of story would work for lots of different people. And so we have the beautiful woman who is in tragic mourning, but who is worked up about her frustration with a bunch of losers running her city/country, something we can't relate to at all. And she puts on all of her beautiful clothing, and she goes out of the city and pretends that she is afraid and is running away. And so she knocks on the door of Holofernes' tent, and she goes, "Hi, I'm beautiful, and I'm running away from those goofballs up in the city. I'd like to hang out with you, please. And by the way, aren't you a big, beautiful, burly man? And that beard with all that funk in it is perfect and beautiful, and that nasty smell of this camp just makes me happy and gets my motor running." And Holofernes, who is as dumb as a dolt, says, "Oh, I'm sure she loves me for me. It's wonderful. She doesn't care about anything else. She loves me for me." And of course, you can see here, people having fun with telling this story. And so this doofus, Holofernes, says, "Hey, I'm going to throw a party tonight. It'll be great. Come and hang out." And so he basically tries to seduce her, not realizing he's the one being seduced. Everybody drinks too much. This is an era before Old Charter 10, but people are drinking, and they're drinking heavy. And so Judith pretends to get drunk. Holofernes gets drunk. And in an obvious callback to David and Goliath, as Holofernes is laid out in his tent, thinking that he has invited the beautiful Judith in to sleep with him, she takes out his sword, cuts his head off, and the story advances. We have this moment, and there are a number of paintings. One is in particular by a man, I can't remember his name, it's not Caravaggio, but it's called The Beheading of Holofernes, and it's got this gorgeous woman, Judith, holding up this gruesome head with this sword. It's a beautiful painting. Look it up if you think, the Beheading of Holofernes. So she then takes the head, and she sneaks back into the city. She's a sneaky one, apparently, despite the massive clothing and makeup and all the stuff she's wearing and all the chinkly little jewelry. She sneaks back into the city, and all the old men are gathered around cowering, and there she comes, and she throws off her cloak, and there's the head of the enemy, and it's all very dramatic. And so the people of the city go, "Oh, wonderful, we're saved by Judith." And she's like, "You bunch of idiots. God is the one who did all this." And so they put Holofernes' head on a spear, and the soldiers kind of get themselves fired up. There's a dramatic speech, and then we're out into the camp, and the Jewish soldiers utterly destroy the army of the Assyrians. The city is saved, the temple is saved, everything is saved, and the Jews have the victory because they trusted in the Lord. We end with a song, a canticle of Judith, and we find out at the very end that she remained a widow her whole life. She never remarried, and that she lived to the ripe old age of 105. The end. It's a story that is fun. It's a story you can read in one sitting. It's 16 chapters. It is a delight. And you could imagine just how much people would have loved to hear this story again and again and again, and how one person would have emphasized, the beauty of her. Another would have gone through all the details of how many war elephants there were and all that kinds of stuff. But the book itself is a lot of fun. The story is a lot of fun. It was very, very frequently retold, and it really brings up some things that are nice because it emphasizes the role that a woman could play, the role that the cowardice of men. It emphasizes a lot of things that were not normative in Jewish culture and kind of shakes things up a little bit. In a very, very slight way, it is connected to what was in France called the Feast of Fools and what we now think of as a Mardi Gras celebration. The idea is to turn everything on its head in order to show the silliness of some of the structures that are there. Now, as I said before, the story is powerfully intended to emphasize the unwinnable nature of the situation and then to show that God can conquer anything, no matter how bad everything seems. And it's the same way with Tobit, right? You have the little girl who's now lost 7 husbands to the demon. You have Tobit who is blind, who is hateful to his wife now all of a sudden. And what could possibly save us? Well, the archangel Raphael shows up, and Tobias saves the day through the intercession of God. We're going to see the same thing in Esther. The world is ending. It's all going to be terrible. Nothing could possibly make things better. Then 10 verses later, oh, everything's fine again. Yay, wahoo, and here's a song for Esther. Another important theme that arises as you're reading is to ask yourself, who is the true God? Because now we have not just people fighting, but we have gods fighting. We have the god of the Assyrians, we have the god of the Medes, we have whoever is in charge of Achior the Ammonite, who ultimately is going to convert to Judaism after watching all this play out. And then we have the god apparently that the elders believe in, who is some kind of wimp who can't be bothered. And then we have the god that Judith believes in, who gets the job done. And so there's a lot of these nice little subtle allusions to who is the true God, who is actually in charge, and what do we know about God, and who is he really? We also, or I should say, people who were adding in these details that ultimately made it into the book would have been doing so 400 years after Nebuchadnezzar had won the war. Which, I mean, is worth remembering. This is a story that takes place when Nebuchadnezzar is trying to get the Jews to do what he wants to do. We know, because we've already read the books of Chronicles, that Nebuchadnezzar won the war. He captured the Jews, took them away, destroyed the temple. And so one of the questions that's kind of swirling around in the book of Judith is, was God really the God of everybody, including Nebuchadnezzar, if he ultimately won the day? And how does that work? And so there's all kinds of these themes kind of subtextually happening. So that kind of gives you the overview of the book of Judith. It's easy to read. It's 16 chapters. It's one story. It's a simple narrative, easy peasy. I recommend reading it in one sitting if you can. Like I said, 16 chapters is maybe an hour, hour and a half. It's very, very, very nice. And alongside Tobit and Esther constitutes not a trilogy in that they're all connected, but these three very much us kind of books, books that we can relate to, stories that we can get a hold of and understand, and that have a lot of good subtext, but none of which weigh us down. It's not like saying, I'm going to read the book of Numbers, and ultimately you feel like you're pulling teeth just to make it through. It's great to read. And so there's no cautions, no notes when it comes to reading. Just enjoy it. It is the action movie of the Old Testament. And so thank you for joining me on the CU CateCast. I've been Father Ryan Humphries, and hopefully we will see you later on.